The Jedi Order's inability to detect the Sith did not originate from a lack of sensitivity to the Force. It originated from a systemic shift in methodology. By the late Republic, the Jedi had reoriented their attention away from interpersonal observation and toward abstract Force readings. This shift is visible throughout the prequel era. Jedi consistently interpret political and personal developments through metaphysical indicators rather than behavioral analysis. Their practices show an institutional over-reliance on the Force as a diagnostic tool and a corresponding decline in psychological awareness. This limitation becomes evident in their interactions with Chancellor Palpatine. Throughout the prequel films, he displays numerous behavioral patterns associated with political manipulation, such as strategic flattery, targeted counsel, consolidation of authority, and exploitation of legislative loopholes. These are visible behaviors, yet the Jedi do not investigate them. Instead, they focus solely on whether the Force reveals an immediate threat. Their failure is procedural, not metaphysical. They prioritize detection of dark side signatures rather than scrutinizing human conduct. The Jedi Code's emphasis on detachment further contributed to this disconnect. By conditioning members to minimize attachment and emotional recognition, the Order reduced its practitioners' ability to understand or interpret emotional cues in others. This limitation is demonstrated in multiple scenes in which Jedi Masters fail to identify Anakin's evident anxiety, anger, or isolation. They recognize shifts in his Force presence, but not their psychological origins. This dynamic suggests that the Jedi had deprioritized empathy and interpersonal interpretation in favor of doctrinal distance. The Council's assessment of political events illustrates the same problem. Instead of studying legislative behavior, voting patterns, or patterns of emergency power expansion, they attempt to interpret disturbances in the Force as their primary source of intelligence. Palpatine's ascendancy relied on legal processes, not metaphysical shrouds. His policies were openly transformative, yet the Jedi focused on Force blockages rather than political indicators. This misalignment allowed procedural authoritarianism to advance without meaningful Jedi scrutiny. Historical Jedi practice once emphasized negotiation and diplomacy. These roles required attention to emotional states, motivations, and interpersonal dynamics. Yet in the late Republic era, the Jedi prioritized meditation, prophecy interpretation, and metaphysical monitoring. They treated the Force as an all-encompassing analytical system. This reliance reduced the need for observational skills and created a structural vulnerability. When the Sith shifted to subtler tactics, the Jedi had no compensatory framework for detecting them. The Jedi's inability to identify deception is reinforced by their interactions with Count Dooku. During his conversation with Obi-Wan on Geonosis, Dooku states that a Sith Lord controls the Senate. Obi-Wan dismisses the claim without considering behavioral evidence or political context. His rejection demonstrates that Jedi training conditioned members to treat Force readings as the only valid source of truth. A statement unsupported by their metaphysical assessment was disregarded, even when backed by observable irregularities. Anakin Skywalker's development further evidences the Order's diagnostic shortcomings. The Council senses turbulence in his Force presence, but fails to interpret the psychological causes. His fears regarding loss, his dissatisfaction with Jedi restrictions, and his susceptibility to external influence are evident in his dialogue and actions. Yet the Jedi do not address these issues directly. Their guidance remains doctrinal rather than personal. This demonstrates an institutional gap between sensing emotional disturbance and understanding its content. The Jedi's evaluation of Palpatine's relationship with Anakin shows the same deficiency. The Chancellor's targeted mentoring, frequent private meetings, and sustained influence over Anakin's worldview constitute clear behavioral markers of manipulation. Despite this, the Jedi interpret the situation primarily through Force-based intuition, rather than conventional indicators of grooming or political recruitment. The absence of emotional literacy allows Palpatine's strategy to progress unhindered. The Jedi's reliance on preconceptions also contributed to their failure. They believed the Sith operated from secrecy and aggression rather than from public office and diplomacy. This assumption is explicitly referenced throughout the prequels, as the Council repeatedly asserts that the Sith would reveal themselves through detectable dark signatures. Because Palpatine exhibited none of these expected signs, they did not consider him a suspect. Their detection model was outdated relative to the Sith's evolving strategies. The Order's interpretive framework also demonstrates an increasing formalization of Force analysis. Yoda repeatedly references a shroud or a clouding of the Force. The Jedi interpret this phenomenon as an obstruction that prevents accurate readings. However, instead of adjusting their investigative techniques toward empirical observation, they choose to focus more heavily on meditation and metaphysical inquiry. This decision shows an institutional assumption that the Force would eventually reveal the truth without supplemental investigation. The Jedi's advisory role in the Senate deteriorated for the same reason. They approach political concerns through predictive Force insights rather than through analysis of legislative patterns or policy behavior. Palpatine's accumulation of emergency powers and his influence over committees should have triggered practical concern regardless of Force readings. Yet the Jedi continued to approach political issues solely through metaphysical interpretation, delaying intervention and reducing their ability to anticipate authoritarian shifts. During the Clone Wars, the Jedi's responsibility expanded from spiritual guidance to military leadership. This transition further weakened their ability to focus on interpersonal and political observation. Their increasing involvement in combat forced them to rely even more heavily on the Force for rapid decision-making. This intensified their dependence on metaphysical indicators and further diminished their capacity for reading human behavior. The war environment accelerated institutional deterioration. The Jedi demonstrate this decline most clearly in their failure to monitor clone behavior before Order 66. They rely entirely on the Force to detect potential threats and do not consider biological or neurological manipulation. Their metaphysical approach prevents them from identifying the inhibitor chips despite numerous behavioral anomalies among clone troopers. Their methodology lacked scientific, psychological, and investigative breadth. The Jedi structure also impeded internal critique. Members rarely questioned council assumptions, and doctrinal authority overshadowed empirical assessment. This closed system prevented adaptation. When the Sith deployed tactics that relied on emotional influence, political control, and deception rather than overt dark side presence, the Jedi lacked procedural mechanisms for recognizing the shift. Their doctrinal rigidity amplified their vulnerability. The Jedi's detachment doctrine produced a training environment in which students learned to disregard internal emotional information rather than interpret it. This is demonstrated in Anakin's meetings with the Council, where his frustration, fear, and desire for recognition are evident through dialogue, posture, and tone. These cues receive minimal acknowledgement from the Council, which prioritizes compliance with protocol over identification of underlying emotional drivers. As a result, the Jedi consistently misinterpret or overlook emotional states that signal vulnerability to external influence. The Jedi's reluctance to discuss emotion openly contributed to their failure to recognize individual distress. Members were taught to equate emotional restraint with discipline, creating a culture in which internal conflict was rarely addressed directly. This environment allowed unresolved emotional tension among members to go unnoticed. The inability to identify distress is evident in the Council's interactions with Anakin, who repeatedly expresses concern regarding visions of loss. Instead of examining the psychological implications, the Jedi respond with doctrinal generalities rooted in detachment. This structural aversion extended to the Jedi's interpretation of external threats. They presumed that the Sith would reveal themselves through aggression, fear, or malice, which the Jedi associated with emotionally charged behavior. However, the Sith adapted by presenting calmness, empathy, and cooperation. Palpatine's interactions with the Council reflect this strategy. He uses diplomacy, measured tone, and political courtesy to appear unthreatening. The Jedi equate calmness with safety, failing to recognize that emotional presentation can be strategic rather than genuine. Palpatine's dual identity exploited this weakness. His public persona embodied composure, patience, and approachability. The Jedi interpreted these traits as indicators of moral alignment rather than recognizing that emotional presentation can be shaped for political effect. This misinterpretation demonstrates that the Jedi lacked a framework for distinguishing between authentic emotional states and deliberate performance. Their training focused on metaphysical detection rather than behavioral evaluation, leaving them unprepared for adversaries who used emotion strategically. The Jedi's institutional fear of emotion also affected their political assessments. The Senate operated on persuasion, rhetoric, and public sentiment. Yet the Jedi approached political developments primarily through force readings rather than psychological or socio-political analysis. Palpatine's speeches, public statements, and appeals to security concerns contain numerous indicators of political manipulation, but the Jedi interpret these events through metaphysical uncertainty rather than through emotional or rhetorical analysis. Their assessments remain abstract and divorced from observable political behavior. Anakin's progression toward the dark side offers additional evidence. His strong emotional responses are consistently misinterpreted as signals of potential instability, rather than as warnings of external manipulation. When he expresses concerns about his mother, his visions, and his perceived lack of trust from the Council, the Jedi address the symptoms rather than the underlying emotional landscape. Their responses emphasize control rather than comprehension, leaving Anakin vulnerable to an authority figure who provided the validation they withheld. The Jedi's approach to attachment demonstrates the depth of their fear-based avoidance of emotion. By discouraging strong interpersonal bonds, they limit opportunities for emotional openness. This doctrinal restriction reduces the likelihood that members will communicate feelings of fear, confusion, or distress. Consequently, individuals experiencing internal conflict become isolated. This isolation is evident in Anakin's inability to confide in the Jedi regarding his visions of Padmé's death. The Order's norms discourage such disclosure, producing an environment conducive to manipulation. The Jedi's assumption that emotion inherently leads to imbalance prevents them from developing tools for interpreting emotional states as informative data. They treat emotion as something to be suppressed rather than examined. This creates a gap in their understanding of how individuals can be influenced. Emotional influence is a primary mechanism of political manipulation, and the Sith use it extensively. The Jedi, lacking expertise in this domain, become ineffective at identifying how emotional appeals shape decision-making. The Order's training practices emphasize meditation and suppression techniques rather than emotional intelligence. This training is designed to maintain internal stability, but does not equip members to analyze external emotional cues. Jedi Masters frequently demonstrate uncertainty when confronted with unexpected emotional reactions in others, such as Padmé's concerns about political developments or Anakin's distress during council meetings. Their lack of response indicates that the Order had deprioritized interpersonal sensitivity in favor of doctrinal consistency. The Jedi's limited emotional interpretation also affects their investigative strategies. When examining potential threats, they prioritize metaphysical clarity rather than assessing behavioral inconsistencies. This is exemplified in their investigation of the clone army's origins. Despite irregularities in the Kaminoan account and the suspicious use of Sifo Dyas's identity, the Jedi focus solely on whether the Force reveals deception. They overlook evidence that requires evaluation of intent rather than interpretation of metaphysical disturbance. Similarly, the Jedi misjudge Count Dooku's political rhetoric. His critique of the Republic's corruption and the implication that a Sith Lord controls the Senate provide substantive political claims. Yet the Jedi dismiss these statements because they do not align with their force-based interpretation. Their aversion to emotional nuance and political context results in a failure to evaluate Dooku's claims through logical analysis. They disregard the emotional tenor of his warnings, which indicate sincerity rather than manipulation. This pattern extends to the Jedi's handling of the war. Their aversion to emotion causes them to underestimate how fear, insecurity, and dissatisfaction among the Senate enable Palpatine's accumulation of power. They interpret political shifts through prophetic language rather than through analysis of public sentiment. The Jedi's metaphysical focus prevents them from recognizing how Palpatine's messaging exploits widespread anxieties. Their inability to interpret emotion at scale renders them ineffective at predicting or responding to political developments. By the time the Jedi recognize the extent of Palpatine's power, Their institutional limitations prevent meaningful action. They attempt to confront him using metaphysical justification rather than political or behavioral evidence. Their approach fails because the Senate and public operate within emotional and political frameworks that the Jedi no longer understand. The Order's fear of engagement with emotion leads directly to its inability to articulate a persuasive case against Palpatine's authority. Ultimately, the Jedi's weakness was not an inability to sense the dark side, but an inability to interpret human emotion. Their detachment doctrine removed essential cognitive tools needed to identify manipulation, political strategy, and interpersonal influence. The Sith exploited this gap by operating through emotional channels rather than through metaphysical disturbance. The Jedi were not defeated by the dark side's power. They were defeated by their own decision to disengage from the emotional realities that shaped the galaxy.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.